here this morning. We're going to ease into the day. I just want to share an important photograph with you all, just to start us off nicely. And here's your thought for the day. We have a couple feeding sweet potatoes to some manatees that look like sweet potatoes. So there you go. Anyway, I just thought that would be kind of like a calming way to start before we get going. And I know that this week is our exam week, and you might be a little nervous, but just think of the manatees and their sweet potatoes. Okay. So today we're going to look at the cross-cutting theme of sustainability. But before we do that, I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to make sure that we're all on the same page about what I want you to do for today, tomorrow, and Friday, okay? So if you haven't come to class in Blackboard with these documents open, go ahead and make sure you've also accessed our Google folder, and that you've opened our February 3rd breakout Google Doc. And if you would also, in that same classroom doc, go ahead and just double check and confirm your group assignment. Pretty much everybody who signed up for their countries are doing those countries, but there were some sub-regions that had more than 8 people actually sign up, so I've broken you into 2 different groups. So like the Middle East, for example, has 2 groups, so it's group 1 and group 2. Anyway, when we go to breakout session today, you're actually going to put yourself in your own groups by number based on what you signed up for on the Google Doc. So if you haven't double checked that, just mark down maybe on a piece of paper in front of you what number group you are in. So you got open assignment number 2 that you might be able to work on the second part of class, the breakout Google Doc, and if you need to confirm your country sign up, go ahead and do that. And then finally, go ahead and open up a tab to the Sustainable Development Index. Nikki, you want to go ahead and put that link also in the chat so people can just do that right now as well? Okay. All right. It's also on assignment number 2. Yes, assignment number 2 is on Blackboard, and it should be there, and it should be available. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about exam 1. Please review all of the information that we have posted at the exam link on Blackboard. It will answer a lot of your questions. So I don't want to spend too much time going over information that's already posted there for you. Just a couple of highlights. The exam will be 75 minutes, which is our entire class time. It will have a mix of short answers, multiple choice, and multiple answers. And there's approximately 20 multiple choice and multiple answers and about 18 or 19 short answers. Some students have asked, what should you focus on? And my response is, the lectures are essentially the skeleton of the course, putting the bones in place, if you will. The readings and the videos begin to add more detail and information. Where the readings, videos, and lectures overlap with lectures is what I really want you to focus on. So some of the readings don't always necessarily cover they oftentimes cover more than what I will cover in lecture. I'm only going to hold you responsible for those concepts and terms and examples in the readings or videos, show or discuss in more detail those that I've introduced in lecture, right? So a really good study strategy would be to sit down with lecture notes, look at your readings, look at the videos, and make sure that where they all come together and overlap, you know. Okay. One of the questions that was just in the chat said, what are commonly missed questions? I think mostly it's that you probably are reading some of the short answers or short essays a little too quickly. Make sure you understand what you're being asked to do. So, for example, if I ask you to identify the 3 E's of sustainability, all you would need to do is basically a word or a phrase. That would be a complete answer. However, if I ask you to discuss or describe or explain, you're going to need to give us some more detail, perhaps even fleshing out an idea with an example or something specific. So some of the short answers are going to be really just like bullet points, but others are going to require you to write in full sentences and make sure that you're providing enough information to have a complete and thorough answer. So that's where we see a lot of students struggle a little bit, is giving us a full answer. So luckily for you, we do give partial credit on those short essays, but if you, if you're not scoring full points, it's probably because you just didn't take the idea all the way through to being a complete, thorough idea. Okay, the other thing is that you all must download Respondus Lockdown Browser. If you have not done so, you probably need to give it a try at least today or tomorrow. That way, if you do run into trouble, you can contact Blackboard IT and they can help you maybe through troubleshoot some of the issues, because it could be particular to your computer. One of the ways to tell if you've downloaded Respondus Lockdown Browser is to take the practice test, because the practice test requires Lockdown Browser, so you wouldn't be able to answer or access the practice test unless you've downloaded it correctly. And someone asked how many questions are there. I think I already mentioned that there was, what's the difference between a multiple choice and a multiple answer? A multiple choice question will have only a single correct answer to choose from. A multiple answer could have multiple answers that are correct depending on the stem of that statement. Okay, so multiple answers, for example, if there's 5 answers, 3 of them may be correct, and you'll want to select all of the correct answers that match what you're being asked to do. So Caitlin asks, is this open notes? Well, yes and no. Okay, so you have 75 minutes. There are enough questions that you're going to have to move through fairly quickly in order to be able to answer all of the questions. So in theory, you could use your notes. You could even pick up the book and look through the book. However, with Respondus Lockdown Browser, it's going to prevent you from opening anything on your computer. But even if it did, in reality, you're not going to have time to look up all the answers. Okay, so I would, if I were you, as a smart study strategy, assume that this is really, for all intents and purposes, the same as taking an in-person exam, where you really do need to make sure that you've done as much studying and preparing in advance of sitting down to take that exam, and that you don't necessarily need to worry about or will have time to go ahead and open up documents or search for the answers. Okay? And because I know that some of you are in different time zones, or because I think some of you might operate more efficiently, or maybe your brain turns on better at, after the 4th cup of coffee at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can take the exam anytime on Friday. So it opens up right after midnight, and it will stay open to you to begin as late as 11:30. Once you do start the exam, however, that timer counts down. So it's not something that you can pause and come back to. You will have one go once you open it up and start. Okay. Let's see.
Lisa, can I share with everyone about the review session tomorrow? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yes. Hey guys, tomorrow Lena and I are holding a review session for the exam at 7:15 p.m. We're going to have it in Blackboard Live. So the way we hold it is you guys come, you ask questions, we answer them as best we can, and that's it. But we're not going to be like just lecturing on key concepts. You guys have to come with questions, and we'll try to answer them as best we can.
Okay, and someone asked, is there a study guide? And my answer is nope. That you guys can certainly put one together as a crowd. If you want to use our Google Drive to start a crowdsource of a study guide, that would be great. If you guys want to type up your most frequently struggling questions, you can do that, and then you can bring that to the exam review as well, and Nicole and Lena will be very happy to answer some of those questions. So let's see, I think I've answered all the questions. Are there any other questions before we get going on our topic today about exam 1? Okay, so the good news is that last fall, I had students report that Respondus Lockdown Browser was not much of a problem. However, there may be, if you're an international student and you are, um, if you're prevented at all by your country from being able to access like all of the browsers, Blackboard IT may have a good workaround through the VPN process, okay? So make sure you give yourself enough time. And Claire started a study guide. Way to go, Claire, yay! And you can certainly add to it. And in fact, I promise you one thing, I will hop on tomorrow at some point in the afternoon, and if I see, if you guys have some commonly asked questions, I will try and answer some of those questions. Or if I see something that I think is incorrect, I might say, you might want to look that one up. All right, so I will certainly do that. And I think Nicole already posted a link to the Google Drive, just a couple ones up, a couple of comments up. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so let's get going today on one of our big cross-cutting themes, which is sustainability. So like globalization, inequality, and uneven development, sustainability is kind of our fourth cross-cutting theme that once we get going on our big topics like economic geography and population geography, we'll begin to see those four themes really both affecting trends and processes and also kind of at the heart of challenges over the course of the future, right? So sustainability is a really important theme. And one that I've been really involved with since helping to launch the Sustainability Minor. So full disclosure, I also teach in the Sustainability 1001 Introduction to Sustainability class. So if you've had that class, you probably had the introduction to the sustainability, but no harm in hearing it a second time because it's really important stuff and sometimes it takes a while for it to kind of all sink in. So one of the really interesting things is what can we say about the last 40 years on this planet? Like if we were to give the planet a report card, it would be a pretty difficult thing to do because in the last 40 years, much of human well-being has been improving. You know, quality of life, health, other measures like educational attainment, all of these things have been improving, but we've also seen natural systems being stressed and in some cases in decline or deterioration, right? So there's a strange human-environment relationship that has been going on for the last several hundred years that has been, on the one hand, improving economic progress, so to speak, and human well-being, but at the same time coming perhaps with the cost of impacts negative on the natural ecosystems. But as geographers, we're also a little bit more nuanced about saying the big global statements and making sure we also have a very sensitivity to scale, right? So human well-being has certainly improved far more in the global north than in the global south, right? When we look at inequalities and particular issues about poverty, we see that it's highly uneven geographically, and most of the world's poor are in the global south and in the least or the lowest income countries, primarily in two regions, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And while it's also true that we can say globally natural ecosystems have been declining in many cases, that's not always true for every set of ecosystems that we find around the world. So for example, one of the things that is true is that we have seen a growth in enhanced agriculture through crops and livestock. So those ecosystems have been, in some cases, performing fairly well. But we've seen the decline in other ecosystems like rainforest ecosystems, or even in some cases, biomes and ecosystems that we would think of as like tundra, you know, up on the both of the poles, right? So one of the things that I hope you picked up from the asynchronous lectures that we were looking at last week is that we are a very uneven planet. We have billionaires and we have more than 1 billion in poverty. And uneven development has been something that has driven a lot of thinking about what does it mean to practice international development? What are we aiming for when we talk about development and sustainable development? Isa, you want to raise your hand and ask your question?
Yeah, real quick. I mean, going off the idea that it's such an uneven planet, question of pure interest, how does anyone determine 2 billion poor? Like, what is the metric for poor when there's such a disparity between what would be poor in the United States potentially and poor in another country, you know?
Yeah, so there's two measures of poverty, and we'll talk about that in our economic unit a little bit more up close. But there is relative poverty, which is what you're talking about. You know, in the United States, you would be poor if you made under $12,000 a year, right? That income threshold would not be true in, say, a Rwanda, right? So we're really talking about absolute poverty, and there are more than 1 billion people in absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is something that the World Bank defines as someone who has an income of less than $1.25 a day. And absolute poverty would mean that even in a country like a Rwanda or a Mali or Tanzania, where there's a pretty low income country, $1.25 a day would not be sufficient to provide food, clothing, shelter, and kind of your basic needs. Okay, and I think currently we're looking at about 880 people in poverty, according to the World Bank, and that's the World Bank's job. Their big mission since they became established in the 1960s was to eradicate poverty. So they're kind of the go-to international organization who measures poverty. How that gets done is a little bit more tricky, but I think if anything, they're on the conservative side of measuring poverty. That is, they probably are undercounting poverty rather than overcounting. Okay, so this notion of unevenness and poverty, particularly concentrated in the Global South and certain regions in the Global South, led to a lot of discussion starting in the 1980s that built on some of important work that was coming out by scholars and practitioners. So scholars, people like me in the academy, practitioners, people working in development around the world in the Global South primarily, people that might have worked for the United Nations or the World Health Organization or the World Food Program or Peace Corps, right? So together, this kind of community started having some conversations about some of the ways in which uneven development was beginning to manifest itself quite clearly. So in the 1970s, the United States experiences and begins to engage in the environmental movement, which really brings attention to the impacts of industrial pollution, say on the quality of air, land, and water. And we begin to really see this environmental revolution begin, not only in the United States, but around the world, where we are now looking at the idea that maybe for the first time in human history, we're beginning to acknowledge that humans have a tremendous impact on the environment. By the 1980s, the World Bank, who I mentioned before, is kind of the international organization addressing poverty, reported that back then, this is 1980, when there's only like 5 billion people on the planet, they reported 3 billion people were in poverty. And 90% of those in poverty were in the Global South. And their metrics back then in the 1980s was about 1.2 billion that were earning less than $1 a day, or an annual income of $370, or about 1.6 billion earning less than $2 a day, or about $700-ish, right? And that was concerning because, again, poverty, according to the World Bank, is a definition of income, but it's what that lack of income will prevent you from being able to do, and that is fulfilling your basic needs: food, water, shelter, clothing, and education. And then the third area that we see kind of concerns about uneven development coming out was actually about global health statistics. So at the same time, we can talk about human well-being, things like measures of educational attainment, or women's rights, or even longevity, people living longer. There were also some alarming global health statistics that came out. particularly in terms of identifying some vulnerable communities. So global health statistics showed that almost 600 million people around the world had no access to clean water, sanitation, i.e. running toilets, or drainage. And as a result of this, just this lack of access to clean water, there was a high vulnerability to waterborne diseases like cholera, yellow fever, diarrhea. Diarrhea is something that is totally preventable and treatable, and yet the World Health Organization estimated in the mid-1980s that more than 14 million children were dying every year of waterborne diseases, many of them from something like diarrhea, but also some cholera. 14 million children, that is a huge and significant number, right? So basically these three areas, environment, poverty or economics, and health, really begin to shift a different discourse or discussion in the international community about how do we address development in a way that's going to work and work in the long term, work over the next hundreds of years. And so much of the research by scholars and practitioners at that time was highly critical of what we had been doing in the 60s and 70s, because by the 80s it didn't seem to be working. If anything, some of our measurements were getting worse. The environment, for sure, we were beginning to see the impacts of air, land, and water pollution. But also, you know, the World Bank, which was created in the early 1960s, had worked for 25 years on eradicating poverty, and yet it seemed as if more people were in poverty, right? So all of this led to kind of a moment in time in which the international community and development experts wanted to like sit back and think, all right, we need to like, let's rethink this. Let's have some conferences and workshops and really dig into this issue. And so they did. And what happened was the United Nations Commission on Environment and Development actually created a small commission to look at that issue of uneven development and its impacts on the environment, on economics, and on health. Okay, and in 1987, so they started in about 1985. The commission releases its report in 1987. The title of the report is called Our Common Future. And it was the product of, you know, a few dozen foreign ministers, finance and planning officials, economists, and policymakers, as well as scientists and technology experts. And the report is oftentimes referred to as the Brundtland Report. I've highlighted that down here, the Brundtland Report. And it's the Brundtland Report was sometimes referred to that because Gro-Harm Brundtland was the woman who was chair of that commission. Anyway, what they said is that development as the international community had been previously defined and practiced wasn't working, and it wasn't sustainable. And so one of the things they did was they offered up a new concept or term in which they referred to, we need sustainable development. And here is their definition. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So two important things to take from this. One is that, yes, I really do want precision in definitions. Okay, so throughout the semester, wherever we have defined a term or a concept on exams, you should know it very, very specifically. In this case, I don't like paraphrasing of definitions. The Brundtland Report is so important for you to know in its precision because you will see this everywhere when people talk about sustainability. All you have to do is open up the executive summary of any report about sustainability, and you will see them refer to the Brundtland Report or Our Common Future. And they will say sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So having said that, this is the global definition of sustainable development, but you might be scratching your heads going, I really don't know what that means. What does that look like? And you are absolutely right. They created a concept and we've been trying to figure out what does that really look like? How do we implement it and put it into practice? Right. So let me see if I can't tease it out a little bit for you. over the years, we've tried to refine definitions of sustainability, and while there really isn't a substitute for the Brundtland Commission, we have kind of added enough onto that understanding of what we're aiming for that we've kind of expanded it. This might help you be able to understand a little bit more about what we're talking about. So sustainability consists of 3 pillars: development, social development, and environmental protection, or as most people refer to them, the 3 E's, right? So we have the environment, we have economics, we have social or equity, human health, and well-being. And remember that slide just a couple of slides ago where I said, the international community was really concerned about environment and persistent poverty, economics, and also some of the global health statistics that were a little alarming. So we have seen kind of this notion of ecological environment, like moving towards sustainability. You must ensure that environment is protected, that you're protecting it and you're not doing activities that degrade the environment, okay? So that's one of our pillars. Economics is, that people must have opportunities for meaningful jobs and contributions to society that allow them sufficient income to meet their needs. Now, what are needs? That's a whole nother conversation, but let's just say basic needs would be things like food, shelter, clothing, right? So it's not necessarily about aiming to have everybody make $100,000 income jobs a year. It's not necessarily everybody being able to afford a car and drive it as much as we want, right? Because that might have a negative impact on the environment, right? So you can start to see it gets a little complex. Now let's add in the 3rd E, which is broadly considered to be equity. And this would include things like human health, but even more than human health, social justice, right? So areas where gender discrimination is still in place, and by the way, that would be every single country, right? There's not a single country where gender equality has been achieved, or there's racial or ethnic discrimination or discrimination based on abilities or ages or all those things that we looked at with inequalities. That would be part of the E of equity. When you have a society that manages to balance all 3 E's, then you have sustainable development. So it's pretty aspirational. I want you to see how complex trying to figure out, like, if we pass this agricultural policy, which may improve people's access to food, but it might degrade the environment, that might not be a recipe for moving forward, right? So you really have to be thinking long-term impacts of the kinds of decisions that you're going to make. And somebody just asked if we're to define sustainable development on the test, are we allowed to copy the definition word for word? Yes, you should write this down in your notes, and then you will have your notes, and then you will know your definitions. Okay, so let's move on to measuring sustainable development. In a sense, how do we know if we are balancing those 3 E's in a way? Absolutely. Leslie asked, so no country has achieved sustainable development. No country has achieved sustainable development, period. No exceptions. Not Norway, not Sweden, not Finland, and certainly not the United States. Think about all the social inequities in the United States. Think about our contributions to climate change. When we factor in all 3 of those E's, there's not a single country that has achieved sustainable development. That is an aspirational goal for the future. It's what development and development practitioners are currently trying to put in place, are things to move us more towards a more sustainable future, right? So when we think about measuring sustainable development, because that's an important part of, we've got this concept, it's a little hazy and vague, I know, but now we've kind of made it a little bit more tangible by putting in those 3 E's. How will we begin to measure it? Like, how will we see if we're making progress? And so what I want to introduce to you is the Human Development Index, right? So traditionally in the past, before we created the concept of sustainable development in 1987, One way that the World Bank and many other countries and organizations measured development was by just looking at gross domestic product or gross national product, depending on what time of the time frame you're looking at. Okay, so before the Brundtland report was issued, we really measured development by the gross domestic product. Okay, and gross domestic product is a measurement of a country's goods and services that are produced in 1 year, right? So everything that has been produced, all the cars and the records and the toaster ovens and all the services, like all the police who were hired and all of the hotel workers, all of that stuff just gets put in an accountant book, and that's your gross domestic product for a country. We can also do gross domestic product or GDP per capita, which is we all of that for a country, and we divide by how many people live in that country, and you get an average income. Okay, so income was really the proxy for development, but I want you to think about those 3 E's that the Brundtland report introduced. And sometimes just a simple economic measurement of income is not going to capture some of those other E's. It's not necessarily going to capture what's going on with human health or well-being. It's not necessarily going to capture what's going on in the environment. So in the late 1980s, as we're beginning to think about sustainable development, we're beginning to think about the problems with, or the limitations to, using GDP as a way to measure development, right? One of the problems with GDP is that it's just a measurement over a 1-year period, and that's not a very long time frame. So a country's income or GDP could be going up for a year or two, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something positive is happening even in the economy. Averages can hide the significance of problems, right? So when we think about growth in economics, it might be, oh wow, you know, these companies are doing so well, but that may not necessarily trickle down to the wages that they're paying their workers. It also does not account for what we call externalities, and externalities are things like pollution, right? So if you think about a company that's producing more and more cars, they may be polluting more and more in the air or water, but they're not subtracting the pollution that they put into the air and water from the GDP, right? So we're having a negative impact on something like the environment, but we're not subtracting it from overall GDP growth. Or even crime. If we had a crime wave in a country, in say a city experiencing an outbreak of crime, that would actually not get subtracted from the GDP. It would actually get added, because all of a sudden now a city might hire more police or pay them overtime. And so those services would actually count as a positive into the ledger of GDP. And finally, one of the things that we do know is money doesn't always buy you happiness, right? So income does not necessarily correspond with well-being, with a sense of being able to contribute to society and have a meaningful, healthy life. Sometimes having money helps with human health, but it is not necessarily the only way in which we can measure well-being. So for that way, you know, we began to critique development. We also began to critique the way we were measuring development, and this plus the sustainable development idea began to shift how we began to measure development. And so the United Nations in the 1990s, oh, by the way, this is a map showing happiness. This is the Happy Planet Index. And I wanted to highlight this because sad countries are brown, or unhappy countries are brown, and high-rank countries are green. And I want you to remember what you know in your mental map about where high-income countries are versus low-income countries. And I would just say that we have some pretty high-income countries that seem pretty unhappy, and we have some low-income countries that are pretty darn happy, including Bhutan, which is one of the happiest places on the Happy Planet Index. So not money is not always, no, this is not in the last year, Andrew. Good question. This is for the most recent year, and I think that that was about 4 or 5 years ago. So it's not counting Venezuela probably would not be so happy now, right? So it's something that shifts over time as well. This is just a snapshot of time. So in the 1990s, the United Nations began to officially evaluate development using the Human Development Index. And this measures, it's an index, so it's a compilation and a weighting of certain measurements that countries provide to the United Nations. And the index is on a score of 0 to 1, with 0 being very underdeveloped. We don't like that word, but you know, poor off on the development scale, with 1.0 being developed all the way, right? And the Human Development Index takes into account 3 main categories. Life expectancy at birth. Why do you think life expectancy would factor into something like a development index? What do you guys think? What is life expectancy going to show you? Natalie, why don't you go ahead and answer that?
Yeah, so one thing I think that life expectancy can show you is it's kind of a barometer maybe for the well-being of the environment there. So for example, a country that has very high air pollution, that may correlate to a very low life expectancy. But there are lots more factors, things like that, that could be used to see if a country is developed or not.
Absolutely. So life expectancy, the how long a society has average lifespan, really shows you a lot about the quality of the environment as well as the quality of healthcare. So everybody who put in healthcare, you're absolutely correct. It's a proxy for that. And then we also count in average educational levels. What is average educational levels have to do with development? What do you think? How does that lead? What connections do you think that's making to development? Ian, you had your hand up. Go ahead and answer.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, there's also the consideration of war or conflict. For example, looking at at the American history, I believe the life expectancy has risen considerably since the time of the Civil War, which could be an indicator of how far a country has come since a conflict has been resolved.
Certainly conflict is going to lower life expectancy. Yeah. How about education kind of leading maybe towards things like more job opportunities, right? Literacy levels are really important for opening up more opportunities. And then the third category of the Human Development Index is taking a look at income. I mean, we can't move away from income as a really important measure of opportunity and development. But I think what the HDI does is it really expands on that notion of, hey, we just measure development by looking at income. It's like, okay, no, we're going to step back. We're going to look at some of these more nuanced measurements that give us a sense of the other 2 E's, right? And actually, education is one of those E's that falls into equity, but education is really strongly related to income earning potential, right? So the longer you stay in school, the higher your ability to earn a higher income is, right? So let's take a look since we're in the geography class. Okay, so here are some of our highest and lowest. This is for the most recent year. So, oops, I'm sorry, I just stopped sharing. I didn't mean to do that. Get back there. So the Human Development Index is something that is the United Nations puts out every 3 years. So we're waiting on the 2021. So this is 2017. It's the most recent year we have. And you can see in the highest category, we have a Norway, Switzerland, Australia, Ireland, Germany. We got a lot of countries. The United States is way down here, not in the top 10. Why do you think the United States is not in the top 10 in the Human Development Index? Pietro, why don't you give us your answer?
I think because the sheer size of the United States also means that there's more room for inequality, as well as if you look at social histories and the way that the United States has developed. There's certainly some people who are living very well off, but there's also a lot more people who are struggling day to day, just to get food on the table.
Yes, we actually have some measurements around a variety of things. No, it has nothing to do with the population being bigger, because this is an index that doesn't really matter how many people you have in your country. It is much more about those 3 buckets of categories. So our life expectancy is not as high as, say, a Norway or a Switzerland. We have higher infant mortality rates than almost any other global north country. So maybe this is pointing to something about, if you think about some of the things that all of those highest category countries have in common, one of them is that they have universal health care, right? So we're pretty equal income-wise when we look at all of those countries, but one of the factors that does factor in, we're pretty similar when we look at educational levels as well, but it's really the health measurements where the United States begins to lag behind other high-income global north countries, right? When we look at the lowest, I want you to bring your attention to the lowest. We've got Djibouti, Ethiopia, Gambia, Guinea, Congo, Guinea-Bissau, Yemen, Eritrea, Mozambique, Mali, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone. What geographic pattern are you beginning to see with some of our lowest human development income countries? Absolutely, Andrew, you're right, sub-Saharan Africa, and or places that have had recent conflict, right? So when we look at this, I want you to draw your attention. So someone asked, is there any country that's achieved sustainable development? Not even Norway, right? So the HDI, remember 1.0 is you've achieved it. Now, Norway comes close at 0.95, but it is not, we have not achieved sustainable development. Evan, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, with respect to the 3 different variables that are used to calculate the Human Development Index, is there a measurement of the variance between those 2 things? Because I feel like it would also be fascinating to see which countries, say, excel in education and maybe the health and longevity of their citizenry, but also have very low income. Like Cuba springs to mind as sort of a fluke example, but I'm wondering if there's a way to look at that variant specifically.
Yeah, you know, actually, although the Human Development Index is looking at life expectancy, average educational levels, and standard of living, there's actually 14 or 15 different specific variables that get calculated in there. And so while the HDI doesn't really, I mean, when the reports come out, there is definitely kind of this broad scores that are given, but they do give you access to the whole data bank, and you could, if you wanted, you know, say, look at health expectancy versus income and see that, hey, some countries do better with health that have low income than some countries are doing that have higher incomes. So yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect measurement, but it certainly is more expansive than what was there before. And Brandon, I like your question. You asked, is the 1.0 index theoretically impossible? That's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure. The Human Development Index, I think also because it's going to measure a lot, it's at heart, some of it is also going to get at inequalities. And I would suspect that the Human Development Index we'll never see a country reach 1.0 because I think probably what will happen is the Human Development Index will morph over time and it will begin to capture more of those inequalities. So we'll see. I'll never say never, but at the moment, you know, if we can't solve some of our biggest issues, I don't think that we'll see a country necessarily reach 1.0. Okay, so let me just show you a couple of maps over time. So here's the Human Development Index in 1980. Remember, they didn't actually have the HDI in 1980, so they were kind of forecasting backwards using some of the other data that they had been collecting. So the United Nations collects a lot of data from countries. One of the most important things to think about, though, is that almost all of the information that's collected is voluntarily given by countries. So the United Nations can't demand that a country collect data and report to them. They can only suggest and encourage countries to report data. So sometimes when we look at maps like this one and we don't have data, you might be thinking, why is there no data there? It may be because the countries just weren't sharing that kind of data with the United Nations. So for example, that's one of the reasons why when I put the list of countries for you to choose from, there was a lot missing. And some of that is because there's really sporadic data for some countries, particularly North Korea is pretty famous for not sharing anything with the international community. So we guess a lot about what's going on in North Korea. But let's take a look at the Human Development Index in 1980. So the darker green areas are getting closer to 1, and the light yellow areas are definitely more in the challenging categories, right? Here it is in 2000, so more green, that's good. We're getting greener as a globe, this is good. And then here's the Human Development Index for the most recent year, 2017. So we can definitely see some regional patterns emerge, right? We've got our global north countries, all among the highest HDIs, right? We have some good progress here in, almost not include Bolivia in there, they're a little lighter, but we definitely see Argentina and Chile doing well. We see some countries doing well, and then we've got some regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, parts of Southeast Asia that are still, you know, making progress, definitely making progress from 20 years ago for sure, right? They're making progress, but they're not necessarily at that same level as we see in the global north. So Akbar, you asked, is it all self-collected and reported? It's a combination of both, right? Like countries collect a lot of information, health statistics through various hospital systems, right? They're collecting education statistics from their schools and their school districts and all that stuff that gets reported up. But also we have practitioners on the ground, right? People that are working for agencies, even international organizations that collect data and help to fill in the gaps a lot of time. So data can come from a variety of both national and international sources. And Pietro asked, is it likely that some countries might go back to a lighter shade due to COVID? Yes, I think that's a real possibility. And that's one of the things you guys are going to look at. So Natalie, you want to, did you have a question? Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, hi, Professor. I just wanted to ask, and this goes really well with Pietro's question that he just asked. You said that we were waiting, how long until the next projection of HDI?
It should come out sometime this year, but it may be delayed because of the COVID. So sometimes it's 3 to 4 years, and 2017 was the last year that we have the measurement. So I'm thinking 2021, but so far, like I think I went just the other week to see if the 2021 data is released, and I don't see anything yet. So you know, we'll wait and see. We could.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. This was just sort of a point of curiosity that I had. Do you project any sort of big changes from 2017? Or do you think everybody's going to kind of stay where they are?
I think we're going to see some improvement, but I think that whatever comes out in 2021 is not going to have captured the impact of the COVID pandemic. Right?
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I'll tell you why in just a second, why I think we're going to see some improvement. Because if we look at these 3 maps over time, we're seeing a trajectory, a pattern of improvement. And, you know, patterns take a long time to shift and change. So if we're going in the right direction, I think we'll continue to go in the right direction. But I think there's also the unknown impact that the COVID pandemic may have. So let's take a look at how, so now we have our concept of sustainability. We know how at least the international community is trying to measure it. Let's figure out what they're doing about it. How are they actually implementing sustainability? So remember, our time frame was 1987, the Brundtland Report. 1990s, we get the Human Development Report. Between 1987 and about 1999, we're trying to figure out what the heck are we, what do we mean by sustainability? 1999 comes around, and just in time for the new millennium, the United Nations launches its first attempt at implementing sustainability with the United Nations Millennium Declaration and its 8 Millennium Development Goals. So just take a quick look at these 8 goals. You can see that it was 1, to eradicate poverty and hunger, 2, to achieve universal primary education, that's kindergarten through 6th grade, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, and malaria and other diseases like tuberculosis, and ensure environmental sustainability. And the 8th was develop partnerships at various scales, from local to national to international partnerships for development. So one of the interesting things when we look at these 8 MDG goals is a lot of them are the third E of equity, right? Okay, so let's take a look. Here we have our E of economics, poverty, right? Hunger, education, gender equality, child mortality, maternal health, combating HIV/AIDS. That's your equity, health, and well-being E. Isn't that interesting? So, most people, when they hear the term sustainability, immediately think of environment. But actually, when we talk about development, sustainable development, the equity issues are really very pronounced and predominant. What the United Nations did when it launched the 8 Millennium Development Goals is it set itself some targets, like we want to eradicate poverty by half, we want to eradicate hunger by half, we want to reach 100% of all children going through the 6th grade. Now, one of the things that you can see when you look at this list is a lot of it is primarily aimed at the lowest income countries in the global south, right? Extreme poverty and hunger in terms of the significant numbers of people in the global north, not so significant. Most global north countries have already achieved universal primary education. So the UN Millennium Development Goals were first launched in 2000, and they were to take place over a 15-year period, from 2000 to 2015. And the idea was that countries should work on these over a long-term period, and they should make these a priority for investing. Okay. So there's a short little video that you guys can watch on your own. It's like 2 minutes, and it basically covers some of the positive impacts that the Millennium Development Goals had when they finished in 2015. So I will spoil the story and say there was some great progress, but more needs to be done, right? So we didn't achieve them all, which then led to the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, right? So as 2015 is approaching, the international development community realizes that these are powerful tools at really focusing investment and priorities around development. And they get together and they say, okay, well, we're coming to an end with the Millennium Development Goals. We made some good progress. We still have a lot to do. We should launch another series. So 2-3 years of workshops and conferences later, and here are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So instead of 8, there are now 17. Okay. I want to draw your attention to a couple of them. So no poverty, no hunger, health, education, gender equality. Look, we're still dealing with some of the MDGs. Okay. But one of the interesting things is, we've got also kind of really expanded the environment far more in this set of sustainable development goals. We have specific goals around renewable energy, around climate, around ocean health. Okay, so these are the next 15 years. So they were launched in 2015. They will take us till 2030. So these are going to be, if you're interested at all in development or environment, these are going to be the overriding goals that are going to define the next 10 years for sure. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 2030 we launched another set of sustainable development goals. Who knows what they'll be called then, but you can see that there's a lot more nuance, a lot difference. Now, when you look at the UN SDGs compared to the MDGs, you see a lot more targets for countries in the global north, right? So, I mean, we could talk about this being a perennial issue in every country of the world, but aside from that, the United States has a lot to do on these and some of these, and actually we could even put in here, and we've got some really bad investments that we're really lacking in investment. So one of the things about the Sustainable Development Goals was they're also quite applicable to countries in the global north. Okay, so the underlying premise of the SDGs nicely wraps us up in terms of kind of connecting back to our big themes. Globalization, especially globalization in terms of its impact economically, environmentally, the rising inequalities, uneven development is at the heart of what sustainable development is trying to correct, right? So we see that uneven development has a variety of consequences, from resource use and waste to consumption patterns that are not sustainable, right? We see economic uneven development where we still have persistent poverty, and we see social unevenness where people's health is still not always as good as it could be, and we see those kind of horizontal inequalities persisting in many countries. Okay, so one of the things that I invite you to do is to spend some time looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This website is really great at showing you all the different targets around each of the goals, and they're really pretty specific. So I'm going to wrap up here by talking about why are they important and why are they such a cross-cutting theme, because they really are where we see so much attention right now. We see SDGs really speaking to that notion of sustainability as the focus of international development efforts. And they're trying to do development differently from where we used to do it because they're considering those social and environmental objectives as well as the economic objectives of development. They really help to prioritize and focus public and private investment on development. And I think even more importantly, they're not just for the countries of the global south. They remind global north countries there's still a lot of progress they have to make in order to achieve these sustainable development goals. So how important are these? Well, we see a lot of foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, many foundations, European foundations and funds really focusing on providing money and grants for organizations, companies, individuals that are working on specific SDG goals. Right? So this is, for example, the Gates Foundation, and you can see they were essentially awarding almost $16 million for working on particularly some of the health goals in SDG number 3. Right? But it's more than foundations. We see companies doing this, right? So AT&T supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Who knew, right? We see even Ford and even Walmart. They all have offices of sustainability now, sustainability directors. And some of it is about making the company more sustainable, so maybe procuring more renewable energy, maybe enhance and save the company money, but also reaching out into the community. So, you know, here's, for example, Walmart showing that it was actually going to address SDG 2, which is zero hunger, target 2.1, trying to end hunger among the poor, and doing so by setting some targets around providing meals in the United States to those who are hungry in the US, because there are about 33 million people hungry. Okay, so that kind of concludes our very quick look at sustainable development. What I want you guys to do now is to go into your breakout groups. So initially, Nicole's going to put you into the breakout groups. You're probably not going to be in your actual group. So you're going to want to switch yourself into your breakout group by number. So do that. Start working on the Google Drive. And I just want you guys to get a feel for how the Sustainable Development Goals. So I just talked about sustainability at the big, broad global scale. Now you guys with assignment number 2 get to do a little deeper dive in terms of how is your country doing on some of those Sustainable Development Goals, because we've seen some progress reports begin to come in, and so we now have some measurements about, you know, are we making progress on SDG climate change or SDG water or SDG poverty? And I want you to be able to look at that with an eye towards your country. Okay, so Nicole, let's send everybody to breakout sessions, and we'll come back with a few more minutes towards the end of class to just share some of our findings.
Okay, I'm about to send everyone into a breakout room. I just want to remind everyone that once you go into your breakout room, to switch into the breakout room that aligns with your group from the Google Doc. Yeah.
Hi, so I think there's two groups that are group 15 and 2 groups that are group 16 on the signups. Yeah, I was.
Okay, we'll just bump those down. I'll go, Nikki, you want to go in and just move those numbers down? So whatever, yeah, she's going to go do that real quick. Or I'll go do that real quick.
I only see one.
Okay, I think it just got
Okay.
changed. So
Okay. So is everyone cool for me to start it?
Yes, go.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So it took me a little longer to get through than I hoped.
I thought